I want to just start off by thanking City Mayor of Salford, Paul Dennett, who is leading on the housing strategy review process at the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. Paul engaged with us right at the beginning of the Housing Futures process. We met with him in January and has been very open and welcoming to learning about the research that we're engaging in, and welcomed us into the Combined Authority Housing Strategy Review process this year, which Richard and some of the other steering group members have been participating in. And also finally, just for engaging with our findings and coming here today to talk to us about the Combined Authority's plans around community-led housing. So thanks, Paul. An important way in which the Housing Futures steering group is working in partnership with the Combined Authority is around the establishing of a new enabling hub for Greater Manchester, for community-led housing in Greater Manchester. These hubs are sprouting up around the UK as the movement's growing, and the idea is to have a locally based support structure where existing groups or people who are thinking about trying to engage with community-led housing can go to for advice, signposting, advice on finance, and new contacts and relationships. So as you'll have seen, we've got a session on that this afternoon, so if you're interested to get an update on where those plans are up to, and also to share your views on what you'd like to see from that kind of organisation, then please join that session, which is going to be in the main hall here. And I believe Richard might just touch on our recommendations about the hub also, but I hope everyone's got one of these booklets. So there are some recommendations specifically about the enabling hub in here, and I just wanted to kind of explain what this booklet is for and why we produced it. We decided not to print lots of copies of a long report because most people kind of access reports online these days, but we wanted something kind of easy and tangible that was tailored to all of the different kinds of people who might have engaged with our work so far and who might be interested in community-led housing in different ways. And so the idea is we hope that whether you're from a housing association, from a community-led housing group, from local government, you can find the section that's specifically relevant for you and dive straight in and find some fairly actionable and tangible recommendations to engage with and to take to as a sort of starting point for conversations in your own area, in your own circles. So I hope you find that useful in those ways. The main report is now available to download on the GM Housing Action /Housing Futures webpage. So please do have a look at the main report. Also, I would also like to thank Dr. Richard Goulding. Richard was contracted by the Housing Futures Steering Group in November 2017. He's been working with us since then to co-produce this research and the events programme and all the other kind of associated activities. And I just wanted to take the chance today to thank him for all his hard work, because he's really put the extra mile in and he's done a fantastic job drawing in all his expertise from the housing sector, from his doctoral work on the financialisation of housing associations in Greater Manchester. So thank you, Richard. And we're looking forward to hearing Richard's key messages from the Housing Futures findings today. I also want to thank John Sawyer, Director of Housing at Manchester City Council. John is not late. He very kindly agreed to join us for the latter part of this plenary session today, because we really wanted to make sure we had somebody here who could address questions and contributions around Manchester city centre and some of the kind of more controversial questions around housing and regeneration around the city centre. And he's kindly agreed to do that, so he'll be joining us shortly when we come to the whole room discussion, which I will facilitate. We should have about an hour for that after the panel contributions, and I will try to make sure that that is a kind of a group discussion. It's not just a kind of question and answer format. So please do share reflections, not just questions. And we then have 3 options after the coffee break. I hope everybody has seen those. So you can stay in here, as I said earlier, for the Enabling Hub session. We have Dr. Tom Moore here. Tom, where are you? I should thank Tom also. Tom contributed to the events programme in July on Community Land Trusts and has kindly agreed to come back and run a session today. So anyone who's particularly interested in community land trusts, Tom's going to be running a sort of introduction to community land trusts, the basics. So please join him. It's in the Woods room, which you can reach through that door at the back. And finally, if you would rather have a more kind of general conversation about community-led housing, I will be upstairs in the Mary Quayle room on the 3rd floor. We're going to watch Peg Alexander's documentary, Britain's Housing Crisis, A People-Powered Solution, and then have a conversation about today's event, about community-led housing in Manchester in general. Okay, so at the end of the afternoon we will reconvene in here just for 10-15 minutes, and we will just hear some reflections and feedback from the 3 sessions, and I will also share some choice quotes from our community-led housing action wall, which Julie, one of our steering group members, is going to introduce in a moment. And just say a few words about kind of where Housing Futures is going next and ways to stay involved. But I hope you've all got a, 5 ways to stay part of the CLH network on the back of your programme. So have a think about those, and we will talk about the network and what is the network later. So before I hand over to Richard, I just wanted to orient this final event a little bit in terms of who Housing Futures actually consists of, because we're not always, all the people involved aren't always visible, the reasons we set out on this journey in the first place, and what we hope will be happening next. So Housing Futures was born out of conversations between myself and 2 or 3 people at Greater Manchester Housing Action. And I really wanted to also today just take the time to applaud GMHA in terms of the core coordinators and all the people they've managed to mobilise along the way. They've done such a fantastic job of getting the kinds of conversations that we need to be having happening in Greater Manchester, whether it be about homelessness, social housing, the private rented sector, or community-led housing. They've really lit a fire around housing justice in Greater Manchester over the last 3 years, and I just wondered if we could celebrate that for a minute and give them a round of applause. So, when I started having these conversations with GMHA, there was already work going on around some of those other issues that I've just listed: homelessness, social housing, private rental sector. But they rightly identified that a gap and a useful role for academic partnership that could really build some capacity in a particular part of the movement was around thinking about progressive housing alternatives. And thinking about alternatives is often one of those things that gets sidelined because there's so much pressing immediate stuff to deal with. So it was good to create that space. And this was before Alex Sharma announced the Community Housing Fund. And I think it was a recognition, although we didn't articulate it in that way at the time, that thinking about housing has generally become quite stagnated into this kind of binary opposition between arguing for an expansion in large-scale state or housing association-led social housing, or in opposition to that, arguing for a greater role for market-led housing in the form of private rented or owner-occupier. So Housing Futures was born out of a desire to explore what alternative thinking was already out there, what alternative practices were already out there, and what did they really mean for Greater Manchester. But it was also born really firmly out of a commitment to housing justice, both from the perspective of the Realising Just Cities programme, which is all about finding non-academic partners to create knowledge in the real world that contributes to more just cities, but also the Greater Manchester, the orientations of the Greater Manchester Housing Action Network. And this has been reflected, I think, in the steering group members who responded to the call that went out for participation. And before I continue, forgive me for all my thanks today, but I do just want to recognise those steering group members. Richard and I, this is Richard Goulding, who, as I said earlier, is our contracted researcher and expert on housing. But Richard and I, ultimately we're paid to do this kind of work. We are both we're very passionate about it also. But the rest of the steering group have done this all in their own time. They've put in hours and hours of time to try and make this the best kind of programme it could be. And So can I just ask you to stand up, please? The steering group members, I want to embarrass you. Thank you. So we have Mick Davis. Yes, so Mick Davis is a long-term resident of New Longside Housing Cooperative. We have Isaac Rose, who is one of the key coordinators behind Greater Manchester Housing Action. In a very Christmassy-looking jumper in the middle. Also one of the main coordinators of GMHA, but a resident of Homes for Change Co-op in Hume. And at the back, the lovely Julie Ralph from Sensible Housing Cooperative in Little Lever in Bolton. So thanks guys, because it's been an absolute pleasure to work with you, and I've learnt so much, and you have been so dedicated, so thanks. Right. So coming back to our focus. Our core focus right from the beginning has been to explore what different kinds of approaches to doing community-led housing have to offer low-income areas of our city region amidst the housing crisis. So that was always our intention and our objective. We were particularly concerned with two kinds of neighbourhood: areas on the edges of urban centres who are facing demolitions, reductions in social housing and private sector encroachments, which are resulting in an access and affordability crisis for existing populations and their younger generations, and areas that might be further out but which have experienced increasing disinvestment. And so, to ground our discussion, I just wanted to read out a short extract actually. And I should say that you'll see on the programme that it says we had a resident from Collyhurst Big Local speaking today. Unfortunately, he's had to stay with his mum in London and he couldn't make it up today. But I do have the testimony from another Collyhurst resident that was, she's given me her permission to read it on her behalf today, and it was submitted as part of a response to the Northern Gateway consultation, the Big Locals response, Collyhurst Big Locals response to the Northern Gateway consultation recently. Excuse me a minute. Small cold. So she says, I've lived in this house now for 34 years, and I've lived in the area of Collyhurst and Miles Platting for the past 54 years. I'm quite disturbed by the proposals really, the amount of houses we're losing, and there's no clear thing to say about how many we're going to get back. We've already lost 300 houses, and there's definitely no plans to build 300 from what I've been told. But my main concern is that there'll be nowhere for ordinary people who live in this area to live. For instance, my children are already housed, but my grandchildren are not. None of them can get accommodation in this area already, and if we're going to lose X amount of homes, then those grandchildren will not be able to live in Collyhurst. And it's not fair, as we've lived here for a couple of 100 years now. I mean, I can trace the family back. And I think it's wrong that we have to look elsewhere when we've lived here all our lives. So the interviewer asks her, well, why would your family not be able to live here? Because some of the plans involve building new homes. Well, the prices of them. We already have modernisation and regeneration is going on in the area, and I know for a fact that they are not affordable whatsoever for people in this locality. People cannot earn the amount of money to buy these homes or to rent them. They're just out of our league. Thousands of people work here, but they haven't got fantastic jobs, lots of them, and this is why we live in this accommodation. This is all we can afford. But people live here and pay their rent and pay their council tax like everyone else, and now the accommodation is just getting less and less. Where are all my relatives going to go? They're just not going to be able to afford these. It's ridiculous. The prices for homes and rent, I can't even imagine how much the rent will be. I know these ones near me already. I mean, I live in Collyhurst, and I know these homes in Miles Platting at the moment. One of them's being costed at £750 a month. That's rent. That is completely out of anyone's league in this area. So if that's anything to go by, and that's a house already here, that's my major concern. So these are the kinds of communities that we wanted to explore in terms of what kinds of community-led housing might have something to offer in these kinds of areas, and in what ways. you will have to be the judge of whether we've managed to do that on reading the report. Richard and Tom, who's over there, and myself were actually in Collyhurst at the end of October to do a community-based briefing about what's happening with housing in Greater Manchester and about community land trusts as one of the options that some communities look into. And it was a pretty sobering evening, I have to say. And anything I say about Collyhurst today is my own impression. I'm not representing people's views from Collyhurst. But there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of confusion, and it sounds like a lack of detailed information, very limited forms of consultation. And this story, this story could be so different. It could be a story about partnership and innovation and bright new alternatives for the existing population, together with imagined new populations. But instead it looked to me like a familiar tale of decisions behind closed doors. We are following up in Collyhurst in January. We're going back to see residents there and to see if there's ways that we can support a process of residents reflecting on what's happening and what they may want to see happen. And we would like to offer that to other communities. We'd like to support communities to talk to each other, share common challenges and learn from each other. We're hoping to take some people from Collyhurst over to some of the residents at Granby, Floor Streets in Toxteth and Liverpool, for example, to learn from their stories. But if you have ideas about how we could do some of those things, or communities that might be interested, please do let us know, because we're really keen to hear from people. So I want to just finish by reflecting a little bit on how people like me, or officers from the council, or housing association staff, relate to people who live in areas like Collyhurst. I was at an event not that long ago about civic futures in Greater Manchester. I think some of you were there. And it was about the need for alternatives to developer-led regeneration. And I looked around the room, and not unlike today probably, although I don't want to make too many assumptions, I just saw a lot of middle-class white professionals. And I asked a question about, well, how can we avoid all these public conversations only ever happening between the kinds of people in this room? How do we get communities who don't usually participate in these kinds of conversations having conversations with each other about what's happening in their area? And as Housing Futures, we've attempted to try and engage with local residents from these areas, and we have had people coming into some events, but we haven't done enough, and we've been constrained, usual story, time, capacity, budget, but it also really does take time to do that kind of relationship building and inclusion well. And I'm not saying that because I want to highlight it as a constraint or a problem. I'm saying it because I really want us to think about the fact that it's incredibly important that we make that time and that we do it better. And that's a real key message that I hope comes away from today. You can't just send emails inviting people to events. You need to go out and meet people. People need to understand what on earth you're talking about. People need to trust you. Sometimes you need to offer to bring people from where they are to whatever it is you're trying to discuss or move forward and take them back. People need support to organise their own community-based platforms and conversations and have those conversations across similar communities. So I hope that that's a message that people take away today, but it's also a message that we hope will become a strong focus within the new Greater Manchester Enabling Hub. Because otherwise that hub will be in danger of only supporting the groups who know how to access that hub. And Housing Futures will now become a working group of Greater Manchester Housing Action, and we intend to play a role within that consortium of organisations that's setting up the hub, and we hope to try to facilitate that. But it seems to me that until middle class professionals recognise their failures and learn, and I'm coming to a close, and learn how to work effectively with marginalised communities, and these are communities that have been placed in a position of long-term and multi-dimensional inequality by wider social and economic forces that are beyond their control. Until we learn how to work effectively in partnership with those kinds of communities, we're going to continue to see the further relegation of people living on low incomes from our urban centres, other than in continuingly appalling levels of homelessness on our streets. And we'll continue to see paternalistic, top-down forms of service provision and regeneration. I'm not arguing against large-scale state subsidy of service provision and development, and nor is Housing Futures. But I am saying that we have to learn to do this differently. And this means finding meaningful ways to actually listen and to then reflect on what we've heard and to respond to it effectively, learning to strengthen what is already there instead of bulldozing through it all and assuming we know best, and learning to share power and control, even if giving people control means that people make mistakes. Because how can communities ever develop innovative models that meet their needs if they're not given space to take risks and make mistakes? So I'm going to leave that question hanging and pass over to Richard to share more with you about our key messages.
Does this work? Can everyone hear me? Yeah. I didn't see what we're trying to fit the mic and the notes all at once. Okay, so hi everyone, my name is Richard Goulding and I'm just going to talk through some of the main findings from our Housing Futures report which we've been writing over the last 12 months. So, as Sophie's mentioned, the aim of the report has been to try and gather an evidence base to evaluate the benefits of community-led housing and explore its strengths and constraints in Greater Manchester and other urban areas. So this has been a process of research partnership between Greater Manchester Housing Action, as Sophie mentioned, and the University of Sheffield Urban Institute, funded by Ministra Urban Futures. So for our purposes, we're interested in the extent to which community-led housing can act as a vehicle for people to set their own housing priorities and meet their needs. In particular, we've been looking at, we've been focused on what potential opportunities there are for the sector to meet the needs on people on low incomes in the city. Particularly as Greater Manchester is once again going through some quite significant changes in its built environment. So in our report, just to go over briefly, we focused on three main types of community-led housing. So housing cooperatives, community land trusts and co-housing. So I should say at the start that these aren't hard and fast distinctions. There's a lot of overlap between these different types. So for example, a community land trust or a co-housing project can be organised as a cooperative, whereas cooperatives and community land trusts are defined by the legal status of certain politics to land. Co-housing is defined by specific design features that encourage shared living within a neighbourhood by an intentional community. Having said that, I think these three do have distinction of historical trajectories to justify looking at them one by one and separating them out. So housing co-ops are the biggest existing type in the UK, and the one most people are familiar with, where the people living in a co-op democratically own and manage their own housing themselves. In addition to traditional co-ops, there's also what are called TMOs, tenant management organisations, where the management of council housing is contracted out to a tenant group living on an estate, and a small number of there are also a small number of larger housing associations organised on a mutual basis called community gateways. So Rochdale Borough Housing would be an example of one of those. While housing co-ops make up the biggest portion of existing community-led housing, the fastest growing type is accounted for by community land trusts. So in contrast to co-ops, community land trusts represent a specific political approach to land and owning land for community benefit. Tom's going to talk about them more in his breakout session later. So CLTs, they began in America as part of rural land reform projects and the civil rights movement. In England, they've become popular over the last 20 years, initially in rural areas, but increasingly in a lot of urban neighbourhoods over the past 10 years. Urban CLTs have also been a little different to rural ones in some cases, in that often the focus isn't just on providing affordable housing, but also on trying to take back a little bit of ownership about urban development. Finally, the smallest overall type we've looked at are co-housing projects. So, as I've mentioned, these are a little different in that they're defined by a group of people who've intentionally come together to form a shared neighbourhood. So, in a typical project, people have individual homes, but a central shared common house where they do things like cook food for each other or look after children. And this aspect of shared living has made co-housing particularly attractive to particular communities of interest, such as older people, environmental groups, or LGBT communities. So, in terms of what community-led housing can offer now, we're undergoing a revival of interest in community-led housing after a period where the sector's kind of struggled. So, the 1970s and 1980s saw a wave of cooperatives being set up, often inspired by squatters' movements and being able to take advantage of a mixture of cheap land in the cities and generous government grants for urban redevelopment. After the late 1980s, it became harder to do this, partly because grants were cut, and also because urban land started to become more expensive in the 90s as cities became subject to speculative investment. So currently, only 1% of people in the UK live in community-led housing, so that's compared to around between 5 and 15% in many parts of Europe. I think there's at least two things that start to change this and lead to a revival of interest, however. Firstly, the aftermath of the financial crisis and the property market crash have demonstrated many of the failings of private sector-led development in terms of providing affordable housing. But it's not just the mechanical response to crisis, there's also been a long history of people that have been pushing for housing alternatives over the past 30 years, and that some of our events programme over the years has covered. And that's really brought out a lot of the way that these hidden histories of people sticking with community-led housing and looking for ways to promote it in their areas has contributed to some of the current revival of interest. And together, that's all laid the basis for community-led housing to start to get a bit more of official policy recognition. So this year, the government's announced the rollout of the second stage of a dedicated community housing fund, making £163 million available for development funding and revenue costs, such as planning, for example, or professional fees over the next 2 years. And there's also been the rollout of a regional patchwork of what are called enabling hubs, which Sophie touched on before. These are supported by organisations like the National Community Land Trust Network, and it can provide access to invaluable advice and support for a lot of groups. They don't have comprehensive coverage yet, but there is one in discussion for Greater Manchester, and I hope to see more of that in the new year. So while community-led housing is still small, there are opportunities coming together for new and existing groups in the upcoming years, opportunities that would be good to try and take advantage of. So I'm working out why we should care about community-led housing. One of our objectives was to evaluate the benefits of the tenure in the UK. So given high housing costs, one of the main areas we examined was affordability. So some types have a clearer track record than others. Co-ops that provide social housing tended to have lower rents in comparison to housing associations. And they also tend to consistently been found to have high satisfaction rates in the social housing sector. Long-term studies into community land trusts in the US have also found that they're capable of preserving affordability over a number of decades because they shield housing from price inflation. The picture's a little bit more complex than that though in terms of affordability, because to make housing affordable to begin with, community groups need to get hold of land at an affordable price, and where they can't get hold of land cheaply, then it can compromise their ability to provide affordable housing. I think this quote from a member of one housing co-op that we interviewed in our study shows some of the trade-offs involved, where after the government cut funding in the 1980s, it became much more difficult for this organisation to afford development costs without increasing rents. Everyone's rent taking a hike. So getting hold of land does remain a crucial issue for affordability in the sector. Having said that, where community groups are able to pull together land and funding, they can make a major difference to their neighbourhoods. So because investment is retained for community use, it enables neighbourhoods to develop while keeping the benefits in their area. So as a result, where projects are genuinely community-led and outward-facing, they can play a huge role in enabling residents to take back a sense of ownership over where they live. And that can be really important in areas experiencing gentrification or demolitions, for example, especially where people haven't been listened to in the past. So I chose this quote from an architect advising an urban community land trust because I think it sums up one of the key issues. in how solving the housing crisis is not just about increasing the supply of housing, but it's also about power in cities and power over land, and enabling people to stay in their areas and to build their areas collectively. I should say, for me, I don't think community-led housing on its own can solve the housing crisis. I do think that ultimately you do need significant public investment by the state to provide housing at the scale that's needed. But I do think community-led housing does have a core role to play alongside this, enabling people to have a more equal say of what happens to their cities and their neighbourhoods. So, in addition, in our research, we also found that the experience of being a member of a well-run cooperative or community-led housing group can have important benefits in addition to affordability. So one issue that came through really clearly was that being able to participate in running your own housing collectively was really positive for building up people's confidence and organisational skills, and could also open up employment and training opportunities. Many community housing groups, such as Lilac in Leeds, have also been really important in creating a space for experiments with environmental design, something that's really important given the consequences of climate change. Certain types in particular, such as co-housing, have also been associated with health and well-being effects, particularly for certain issues such as combating isolation and loneliness in old age, though there is a need for more research in this area to gather hard evidence and quantified evidence about the long-term impacts. But it could make co-housing a significant option for local councils and housing associations in the future. But finally, while there can be problems with some community housing groups becoming insular and exclusive, in cases where they do remain outward-facing, then they can be a really crucial part of developing social enterprise and other areas of the social economy. So, for example, this quote from a housing association chief executive shows how cooperatives in Merseyside have been important in supporting organisations such as credit unions, giving them the potential to have strategic ripple effects that extend beyond any one project. So, having looked at the potential benefits, this brings us to the question of why now in Greater Manchester. So, Sophie alluded to, for the past 30 years, the city region's undergone some major changes following what's called a property-led regeneration model. This involves elements such as trying to attract in private investment, developer-friendly planning policies, and creating big new flagship projects. As shown earlier in the year by a report for Greater Manchester Housing Action produced by John Silver, this has resulted in very little new affordable housing in central Manchester and the city region's urban core. And as the private rental sector has grown in the city, as Sophie discussed, this has the potential for creating displacement pressures for low-income communities. There's been some welcome announcements this week in Manchester, the council looking again at what social and affordable housing it can provide in the centre, which I think is a real testament to the people who've been pushing that in this issue. And I'm also really interested to see the new spatial plan and GM housing strategy that's being produced, and the potential these have got to add to the democratic conversations about land use and ownership in the city, which are badly needed. And I think community-led housing can play a really central role in taking part in these conversations and helping neighbourhoods put it into action. Having said that, there are some challenges alongside these opportunities. The major barrier is land, to be honest. Even in areas where land values are low, it can be difficult to raise finance because you still need to be able to convince the bank that what you're creating will be worth something as collateral. Over the last 40 years, however, land held by the public sector has been subject to mass privatisation. This has been made worse in the last 8 years under austerity measures, where councils have been under huge pressure to sell off land to try and plug funding gaps. You can kind of see the logic there, but once that land is gone, it's gone, and it could be potentially be used for social housing or community-led housing that can help meet wider needs. So again, there's a need for public discussion over land. Given problems of accessing land and navigating development, collaboration with local authorities and housing associations has been a major, crucial source of support for community-led housing in letting people get their projects off the ground. So working with housing associations in particular can be really fundamental to a lot of co-housing groups, for example, being able to provide genuinely affordable housing. While this collaboration is important, many of the people we spoke to in the research did raise some concerns about the potential for unequal power relations to be created if residents are only brought in after all important decisions have been made. So here's a quote from one national representative of the community-led housing sector, putting this in quite strong terms, I have to say. But I think his meaning was that while policymakers and other agencies have a crucial enabling role to play, if that role turns into a top-down process where communities aren't able to lead their projects, then it can seriously undermine the long-term sustainability of the sector if people don't feel that they own their own housing and they're not able to shape the actual effective decisions. And additional issues can also arise from the governance of projects. So participation rates in particular can drop off over time, particularly once the excitement of getting a project off the ground's out of the way. And if participation dwindles, that can lead to projects becoming insular or effectively turning into just a cheap landlord. Currently, there is an effort by groups such as the Confederation of Cooperative Housing and other national bodies to try and address this. They're putting a lot of effort at the moment into business training and housing management, including through the network of regional enabling hubs that are being set up. We want to see the expansion of the sector become sustainable and avoid problems with governance that can happen with some groups. While this is welcome, I think there's also potential. I think there's also a need to foreground and think about education about cooperative values, however, and to think about why being in a cooperative is different to just renting from just another landlord. So this quote, for instance, comes from a cooperative member who's reflecting on why participation rates have gone down, with one potential reason being that individual initial tenant inductions didn't do enough to sit down with people and discuss what a cooperative actually is and how it's different. I think if this is done, there's also a big opportunity for in-depth community development and organising to help spread awareness of what options that there are around community-led housing, including supporting new and established groups to meet with one another and exchange knowledge and learning with their experiences. While this is a long-term process, that in-depth engagement is necessary, I think, if we're to avoid the mistakes of the past, where community-led housing is treated as just another type of landlord and ultimately failed to make a long-term impact. Finally, I'm coming to the end of this now. All of this comes at a really critical time for Greater Manchester. So it's currently underway about the formation of an enabling hub to support community-led housing in the city region. And this hub will be essential in offering access to credible advice and support for new and existing groups. This not only makes it much easier for new groups to set up, but if successful, it can help establish a critical mass of organisations that are going to be absolutely fundamental if the current revival of interest in community-led housing breaks with the past and becomes sustainable over the long term. The devolution of powers in Greater Manchester can also open up opportunities. So the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, for example, has a £300 million loan fund that potentially could be used to support developments, including community-led housing developments. Should stress this money has to be paid back. It's not a grant. But if tailored correctly, it could play a really fundamental role in helping groups get over the hurdles of development. And in addition, one interesting suggestion made by one senior housing leader in local government we spoke to was that a hub could also provide some collective backing for the sector when they negotiate with landlords, acting as a guarantor and helping de-risk deals by lowering the chance that a particular deal with the landowner might fall through. One issue that has come through our research, however, is that hubs do need to be seen as offering credible and impartial advice. And while it's common and often really valuable for organisations such as local government to have a formal role, funders to the sector, such as Power to Change, have also recommended that hubs should have clear lines of accountability when that's the case, including for all of their various partners who can contribute to it. And also that they shouldn't be directly hosted by the public sector, just to give them a little bit of insulation from policy decisions. So, finally, just to conclude, I think community-led housing has a core role in social wellbeing and democratising land ownership. This growth of an enabling hub infrastructure and government funding creates a window of opportunity for the sector. Greater Manchester's devolution can also open the space for a crucial policy rethink on housing strategy and public land, which creates some exciting opportunities. But for safeguard these benefits and to stop them failing for community ownership, there's got to be a fundamental thing to keep in mind as we go ahead. So yeah, thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Richard. I'm going to hand straight over to Paul, and I would just like to welcome John, who I did introduce earlier, so everyone knows who you are.
Great. Okay, can everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay. My name's Paul Dennett. I'm the City Mayor of Salford. And I'm also the Housing, Infrastructure and Homelessness Lead within the combined authority. And I think probably it's in the latter role I'm here speaking today. Community-led housing is something I've always had a real interest in, and certainly in the city of Salford I'm aware of 3 organisations that I would broadly put within this domain. So the housing co-op I actually reside in is a TMO, tenant management organisation. New Barracks is another tenant management organisation in the city of Salford, and Seedley and Langworthy Trust, who I see are here today. So this is an area of housing policy, if you like, that I've always had a political interest in. And actually, before I became involved formally in politics, I was a housing activist, very involved in my Tenants and Residents Association in Greengate, and have a real passion for this agenda, or the housing justice agenda, which has already been talked about. But I think what we need to do is set this kind of conversation, if you like, about community-led housing into its context. And that is the context that even the current government has acknowledged in terms of us having a broken housing market within the United Kingdom. And obviously just reflecting on Greater Manchester for a moment, looking at our housing waiting lists across the 10 local authorities, we've got 85,639 people on those housing waiting lists. Since 1980, in Greater Manchester, 92,612 homes have been purchased under the right to buy. We've lost that stock. Approximately 40% of homes purchased under right to buy find their way into the private rented sector. That's a national statistic. We also have 14,933, almost 6% of social housing stock is let now at up to 80% of market rents. This is what's referred to as the conversion to affordable rents within the housing market. And when we say 80% of market rents, quite often that has, well, it doesn't have any real relationship with what's happening in the labour market or what's happening within welfare in terms of whether or not individuals can truly afford housing. And in a sense, what this brought us to is a housing crisis, which is clearly exacerbating poverty and obviously increasing household and personal debt, and just leading to really a more precarious, insecure society in which residents of Greater Manchester find themselves in. We also have 13,203 homes since 2012-13 sold under right to buy within Greater Manchester. None of those have been replaced with the capital receipts that have been generated. Majority of those capital receipts have been returned to central government, to the Treasury. Why? Because back in 2012 there was some reforming of housing revenue accounts up and down the country, and in there became a threshold for returning receipts if they didn't meet that threshold, if you like. So the big beneficiary is actually central government when it comes to right to buy. So I think we need to make that clear. This isn't local authorities necessarily stocking up a load of cash in their housing revenue accounts when properties are sold under right to buy. And as I said earlier, government has acknowledged that we do have a problem with the housing market. But I would be critical of the government because ultimately, you know, this current government, the one before it, and also the Thatcher government really started to open up the housing market in this country to global capital. Housing became a commodity. It didn't become a place where people lived and spent the rest of their lives. And that has fundamentally changed. And I think what we're doing now is we're re-looking at failed housing policies over those kind of 3 governments, if you like, those 3 periods of time, to think about how we can move forward. In some respects, you know, I'm optimistic, and it was mentioned earlier about the money that the current government, Alok Sharma MP, has committed to Community Housing Fund. So we hear that on the one hand, but then on the other hand, we understand that there's huge problems here in terms of land and community-led housing initiatives being able to access land and the privatisation of land. Now that is a really important point because local authorities like my own heavily rely on the sale of land to finance their existing capital budget. So some of the growth you've seen within the city of Salford over recent years is because of what local authorities at a very local level have been doing with their capital, so unsupported borrowing. And how we pay down that debt is often through the sale of assets, one of which has been land. Now this has been going on for years, this is no new phenomenon, and all of this is inextricably linked with local government financing. And anyone who's familiar with Salford's revenue budget will know that since 2010, we've lost 198 million from our revenue budget as a consequence of cuts to the revenue support grant and unfunded budget pressures by this government. And this year alone, we're looking at taking another 16 million out of that budget. Now, the reason why I'm talking about local government financing is because of that, it makes capital receipts from land all the more important when it comes to setting a balanced budget year on year. So at a local level, what we've got is a government here on the one hand tokenistically committing to some funding for community-led housing, but then taking significant sums of money out of the very agents to actually make some of this happen or facilitate a growth in this sector at a very local level. On top of that, we have problems with the National Planning Policy Framework, and you'll know we've recently revised the National Planning Policy Framework in this country. But that policy framework still protects developer profits over truly affordable housing and over contributions to infrastructure funding. So developers it's often cited that they walk away with approximately 20% profit from developments. I think that's a really conservative figure. I think in reality they're probably walking away with significantly more profits than 20% on a scheme. And as a consequence of that, in places like Greater Manchester, where land values are lower than they are in places like London and the South East, you then enter into this period of viability conversations with developers. And all the time in places like Greater Manchester, where our land values are lower, house prices are lower than places like London and the South East, inevitably we have real challenges when it comes to affordable housing and the provision of affordable housing through the planning system, and also contributions to infrastructure through things like community infrastructure levies and Section 106 agreements. So we have a huge problem as well with planning up and down this country, and viability doesn't necessarily seem to support building truly affordable housing, and certainly not community-led housing. On top of that, housing associations, you'll be familiar, have been seeing a 1% rent reduction year on year over recent years. That's anticipated to change come 2020. But what that's done is it's reduced their ability to actually develop social housing. Why? Because they've not had that revenue coming into their organisations to put into their development programme. And if anyone's seen some recent press about geographical targeting of public capital off the back of the recent autumn budget announcements, you'll also realise that the government at the moment is skewing approximately 80% of billions and billions of pounds worth of public capital here to London and the South East. Why? Because they've taken an arbitrary approach to determining where that money goes in this country. All they've done is looked at median income and median house prices, and where the gap reaches their arbitrary threshold of 8.8, it then warrants the government's intervention in terms of public capital. Now that capital will be spent, but it will be spent not in a way that demands council housing is built or social housing is built, but just because there's those areas of the country with this gap. So am I optimistic that that will solve the housing crisis? I'm absolutely not. So when it comes to the government's approach in policy terms to this agenda, I think we need to consider it within that context. There's a rhetoric, if you like, and there's a real reality here. But for me, when we look at the work that's been produced today, I'm really heartened with some of the recommendations that have come out of this research. And in many respects, the Greater Manchester Combined Authority and my portfolio is taking some of these forward already. So when it comes to the Combined Authority and local authorities, one of the recommendations is to work with community-led housing groups but respect their autonomy. Absolutely. I think whatever we do on community-led housing, we have to respect the autonomy of the organisations and the individuals operating within this sector. Where I see the state being involved here is, in a sense, to facilitate, to provide the necessary seed funding and to provide resources to enable, not to dictate. So I know the concerns that were raised about a top-down approach. That's certainly not something I want to see within Greater Manchester in terms of taking this agenda forward. The other recommendation was to make community-led housing a core component of local authority and city regional housing strategy. Well, I can say today, this is very much a core component of the housing strategy that will be brought forward within Greater Manchester next year. And Andy Burnham and myself are very committed to the notion of co-production. And that's not just a glib kind of tokenistic comment I'm making there. That is a genuine commitment. Do I think I'm best placed to be able to determine the future of Greater Manchester's housing policy? Absolutely not. But in collaboration, I think we can create something quite special for Greater Manchester that ultimately serves the needs of the people of Greater Manchester. There's also a request in the report to provide dedicated officer time through explicit posts. Now, we have already committed some funding actually through the housing investment team within the combined authority to kind of pump prime some of this work around establishing an enabling hub for Greater Manchester for community-led housing. And I understand we've also been successful in downloading some money from the Local Government Association as well to actually take some of this forward. But that will probably only take us up to, in real terms, March of next year. So there will need to be further conversations with officers in the combined authority and across the districts about how we take this forward. I think it's worth mentioning at this point as well, housing is not a city regional issue in a sense. And the reason why I'm saying that is because it's the districts, it's the local authorities that actually have the sovereignty and the decision-making power over housing policy. What we're doing in terms of a Greater Manchester housing strategy is bringing people together. But what happens at a city regional level will not be legally or constitutionally binding because we don't actually have powers through the devolution agreements that have been signed to dictate what happens in Greater Manchester on housing. So it's really important to bear in mind that what we're doing at the moment is very much in partnership with all the 10 local authorities across Greater Manchester. And then from a resourcing point of view, we'll need to consider it on that basis moving forward. Another recommendation is to assist community-led housing groups in identifying and acquiring land. And I have to be honest on this one. This is a difficult one because we're not all in the same space. You know, not every local authority in Greater Manchester has a load of land it can just allocate to this. So some of this is about having conversations with people like Homes England. And if anyone's familiar with their recent strategy that they just launched, it's quite clear to me Homes England are taking a much more active role now in land markets than they have previously done. Some of that is probably coming off the back of the recent Oliver Letwin review, which talks about land banking. And what was interesting about that review is the independent review didn't seem to see that there's a problem with that. But I'm certainly hearing very different issues at a local level within Greater Manchester where developers are not bringing forward development despite having planning permission already granted. So I think working with Homes England is going to be an interesting one because to acquire land will clearly need a much bigger budget than what Alok Sharma's committed in terms of 160 odd million pounds. It's going to require a lot more money than that, I can assure you. So maybe some lobbying of government around this agenda would be quite useful. Also, there's a further recommendation which is about making full use of existing planning and land assembly powers to promote affordable and community-led housing locally. I have to say we are trying to do that, but there's no doubt it is a struggle in the context of austerity and local government cuts. In Salford, we've set up our own development company that sits outside of the housing revenue account, and we're using our land holdings to build truly affordable housing through that vehicle. And obviously encouraging others to do similar things, and I'm sure John can tell you more about what Manchester are up to as well around some of that. But we're absolutely committed to doing that. It's just a balancing act when it comes to setting a balanced budget every year in local authorities about how much of this you can do when you're forced to become reliant on capital receipts from land. A further recommendation is about supporting community-led housing to foster a social economy. Now this is something that really interests me because an inclusive economy is something we've been talking about for some time, and we've been talking about an inclusive growth. But actually, are we really in that space? There's a lot of chatter about corporate social responsibility, social value, trying to measure all of this. But I believe there's a huge opportunity within Greater Manchester for us to really grasp this notion of inclusive economy and inclusive growth and make sure what we do across all of the 10 local authorities is about the people of Greater Manchester. Because I think in the short term that an awful lot of value is being lost from the Greater Manchester economy just because how we do our business. Public procurement across local authorities, hospitals, universities, education institutions. If you aggregate some of that, just think about what we could create here within Greater Manchester in terms of driving social value opportunities for people. I've been perennially frustrated, if you like, with the construction industry. I was at the growth board the other day, and I was talking about, well, where is our strategy for the construction sector within Greater Manchester across all the 10 local authorities? You know, we're seeing development in Greater Manchester at a scale we've never seen before. That presents an opportunity, I would argue, certainly to the political leaders of Greater Manchester, to harness that growth and make sure it delivers for the people of Greater Manchester, whether that be employment, apprenticeships, job opportunities, decent paid employment as well is a key issue within the construction industry, but I don't think today is the right day to talk about employment standards in that sector. Then looking at the recommendations about the Greater Manchester Regional Enabling Hub. So one of the recommendations there is to protect the sector's independence and grassroots accountability. I think that's very similar really to the previous recommendation for the CA and local authorities around respecting their autonomy. Absolutely, we do need to respect the sector's independence, grassroots accountability. I guess my ask of the sector is, can we work across the whole of Greater Manchester in a strategic way, and can we, you know, form some sort of entity that does that, rather than at the moment what we have is, you know, housing associations working with community organisations, certainly in my case, or trusts or co-ops, kind of operating independent of each other in some respects. Can we get more collaboration and coordination and raise that up, if you like, to the whole of Greater Manchester? There's also an ask there in terms of the recommendation to ensure long-term transparency in governance. I think that's absolutely critical for this sector. You know, if there are issues around transparency and governance, you can bet your bottom dollar it will adversely impact this sector moving forward. So ensuring that transparency, public accountability and governance is very much critical for the further development of this sector in Greater Manchester. There is a recommendation to adopt an explicit focus on housing justice and affordability. And, you know, I'm really pleased to say that last time we discussed the housing strategy with the leaders of Greater Manchester, you know, leaders around the table are really keen to have a Greater Manchester definition of affordability, rather than the kind of government's nonsensical definition of affordability, which is 80% of market values. Well, you can't talk about housing markets in Greater Manchester in a homogenised way, because we have so many of them. You know, Didsbury is very different to where I live. In Pendleton, in Langworthy, you know, house prices are very different, and affordability is clearly a very different concept. So working towards a Greater Manchester definition of affordability is something certainly the political leaders of Greater Manchester want to see. And then obviously continuing to campaign around issues of housing justice will be absolutely critical to this agenda. Just quickly finishing up on the other recommendations, and then I'll finish. That is to foster relationships with philanthropic landowners, housing associations, universities and other major institutions to access land and property. Absolutely. We should do this in a very collegiate and collaborative way. And, you know, the bigger we make this in terms of the partners and the actors, the more successful I'm convinced this will actually be for Greater Manchester. And then finally, the other ask is around encouraging environmental design. Well, watch this space on environmental design, because within the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework that's coming forward in January, you'll see some commitments for Greater Manchester around design, in a sense, or commitments to reducing carbon and building that into what we do within the construction industry. So there will be announcements early January around some of that. So, and some of it will be taken forward within the housing strategy, which we expect to be later after January. So in terms of the recommendations that are applicable to me as the portfolio holder, and certainly Greater Manchester and the 10 local authorities, I'm happy to accept those recommendations and work with interested partners to take them forward. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Paul. Really interesting to hear all of those points, and I'm sure everyone in the audience will have a lot to say. John, is it okay if I just give you 5 minutes just to say a few words so that we can involve everybody else in the room? Or do your best.
Hi, it's nice to see some familiar faces, but I'm relatively new to Manchester, so I'm getting to know people, which is why.
Can everyone hear?
No.
Not really. Let's try this one.
Yeah. Does that work? Yeah. Right, okay, we'll begin again. It is nice to see some familiar faces. but I'm relatively new to Manchester, so I like to come to events like this to meet new people and hear new views. I was going to say a little bit about me because it's relevant to community-led housing. Touch on a paper that's going to the Council's executive on Wednesday, which I think is important, and particularly some of the elements around community-led housing within that. I began my life in part living on a council housing estate in Coventry. I'm from a pretty humble background, to be truthful. Regeneration was happening around me at that time, and I was really interested to see how I could get involved as a member of that community, and obviously I was a bit too young at that time. The first job I went into was at Sandwell Council, and I was, for a very unique set of reasons, I was given a 1,000 home housing estate to oversee the redevelopment of. One of the things that was very special about that particular project was that the assets that the council had at the beginning of that regeneration process were transferred into a community development trust. So although I worked for the council, my client, my key relationship, not only was with members, but was with representatives of a community who were given a lot of power and autonomy to drive forward the regeneration of that place. And as you can appreciate, 1,000 homes is a very big place. One of the other things that's very special about that community development trust is, although they and the council jointly took a decision that as part of that regeneration process everybody would be rehoused, the exception to that was the people that served on the board of the Community Development Trust, because they didn't want to be seen to be biased in getting themselves better homes. So they actually opted out of that process, and those half a dozen people didn't get a house in that redeveloped housing estate. You know, but that particular set of circumstances showed me the lengths to which people are willing to go to deliver the right types of places for themselves, but more importantly, those around them. Because that was a very unique set of reasons why I ended up delivering that project, and I was in my early 20s at the time, and you could go and see that project now successfully completed, I decided to go off and learn to become a surveyor, and then to learn more about money, which does help the world go round, I would have to say. And eventually found myself 5 years ago working for a disruptive property developer. And I entirely agree with the comments Paul made that some property developers can make lots of money from their developments. Obviously a certain amount of money is needed to make that process work. And I think what Paul touched on, which is particularly important, is it isn't so much about the amount they make, it's about the regeneration job that they deliver and the social value that they create on that journey for me. And that particular developer I worked for was very strongly and passionately about that, including the facilitation of community-led housing projects in London and other parts of the country. So it was a very special role to fulfil. But I wanted to come full circle back to a council because changing the oil tanker of how, changing the direction of an oil tanker of how a council works is a challenging role, and I wanted a challenging role. So I'm pleased to be the relatively new Director of Housing and Residential Growth at Manchester City Council. And just to be clear, I'm an officer, not a politician, so my views are similar in spirit to Paul's, but sort of conveyed in a slightly different way, because I have political bosses. Things are changing at Manchester, so I've run it. There is a new portfolio holder for housing and regeneration who's arrived at a similar time, and also we have Paul and others at GMCA. For me, these sort of planets are orbiting in a very different way, and as a result, very different things are starting to happen. My portfolio holder, Suzanne Richards, is putting a paper before our executive on Wednesday this coming week. It was aired before our scrutiny last Wednesday. It's a paper that you could download from our council website today, if you haven't already. And I would encourage you to download it and read it, and I'd encourage you to soak up the change in direction which that paper contains. It includes a proposal to deliver 3,000 new council homes. Currently the council is delivering 60, to give you a sense of change. It includes specific targets around social rent. So as Paul explained, affordable rent is linked to market rent. as market rents go up, they drag affordable rents up. Over time, the council's prediction is that the benefit budget will get further contained, and the link between LHA, which is a measure through which benefit budgets are set, and affordable housing will start to break. And indeed, in some parts of Manchester already, such as Wythenshawe, LHA / housing benefit just does not match affordable rent already. So there is a proposal to bring in a lot more social rent into the Manchester housing supply. The council uses the language genuine affordability, Paul uses the language truly affordability or truly affordable. Ultimately, they're very similar concepts. It's about ensuring that the residents of Manchester pay no more than 30% of their household budget on their accommodation. And we're moving away from the concept of an average income that applies across the whole of Manchester to specific incomes that people have in their different areas, because people in some parts of the city earn sub £20,000 a year, whereas others in the city centre earn more than £30,000 a year. Those are markedly different incomes. You'll see in there proposals around older people's housing, which I won't go into today. You'll see in there a feasibility study for a new affordable city centre development. That's a pretty big change, I have to say. Was the focus of a Manchester Evening News piece earlier this week. And you will see in there proposals around community-led housing. There are those that would say, why do community-led housing? And I would just simply turn it on its head and say, why not? So for me, it's really simple. If people have the passion and energy, let's leave budget to one side for a second. People have the passion and energy to deliver their own homes. I think it's my job and our job to help them do so. It's going to be harder. It's not going to deliver the same number of homes that it might deliver if we were to give that piece of land to a house builder who could deliver, relatively speaking, at greater speed. But the benefits it brings in terms of engaged communities who are likely to live there longer, forming stronger communities, for me, are worth that trade. What you will see us having proposed in that paper, and as I say, still needs approving on Wednesday this coming week, is first of all 3 pilot schemes of affordable community-led housing on council sites. Where they will be in the city, still to be determined. We've set a minimum target of 30 homes across those 3, so a minimum of 10 homes each, but they could conceivably be larger than that. It's very much about what comes forward. We're already talking to at least 3 groups, but we're open to more conversations. We're already talking to a number of experienced facilitators who have helped around the country deliver schemes like this. Those facilitators would be working for the groups, not for us. So I echo what Paul said, it's about empowering the groups. We are here to facilitate. So 3 affordable-based community-led housing schemes on the council's land. That's the first step. The second step is very simple. It's to develop a strategy to do more of this, whether that's on council land or other land. Whether that's affordable housing, we clearly want to see more of that, but it could also be market housing delivered on a community-led basis. We want to see a community-led explosion, effectively. The language we use in the report is to unleash the potential of community-led housing. So I think if this is approved on Wednesday, this is a bold new direction for the council. Those are the words that our exec member has used in introducing this paper at that scrutiny last week. I hope you agree things are changing. This isn't necessarily the end of that change process. Indeed, for me, it's the beginning. So, I've come here, Paul's come here, our exec member, all of our politicians want to see significant change in the way in which housing is delivered in Manchester. So for me, this is just the beginning. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John, and to all of the contributors. I'm going to extend our plenary session a bit because I really want to make sure people get a chance to contribute. I'll take 2 questions at a time. The lady in the front and the man who's got his hand up at the back. Lady first.
question for you, John. Is it working now?
Yeah.
That is what you've just described, actually revolutionary. It makes me feel quite emotional. Question is, will it get passed on Wednesday? What are the chances of it getting passed? That's the first thing to it.
Hello, John Nicholson, Chair of Greater Manchester Law Centre. We exist to campaign with others for free access to justice, as I know some members of the panel know. And part of our demands in that comes from trying to help people to exercise their legal rights to housing. And one of the things about doing that is that they have to have some legal rights to housing, which has led us to demand that we should be seeing a campaign for a secure home for all. And it's that context I want to ask my question in, because whilst this focus is obviously on the community-led housing bit, several speakers have said that's got to be in a context, as Paul and Sophie both said earlier, it's got to be in the context of something wider. And in that respect, I have 2 or 3 questions to make. One is, if anybody wants to say that they disagree with the hostile environment which has led councils and leaders of authorities in the Greater Manchester area recently to say that we don't need to house people seeking asylum because it costs too much money and we should give it to other people who incidentally they haven't been providing the housing for in a number of years, so it's a somewhat dishonest call. But I would ask people on the panel to say that that is the wrong divide and rule to be taking. It is wrong to be saying we don't want to house people seeking asylum. Of course the government should be giving more money, but the truth is we want housing for all. And that same stigma that applies across migrants also applies, that hostile environment, to benefit claimants, and it applies often to council house tenants as well, because that language has been used to really pour abuse on council estates over many, many years, and that's an ideological victory for the wrong side. But the other thing that I wanted to ask about the nature of a secure home is that that has to involve, well, safety, no Grenfell. It has to involve security, so you're not evicted in the way many private rented people face Section 21 evictions. It has to involve also something about the security of, and I'm hesitating even to use this word affordability because it's just been disentangled so badly. Apologies for doing this, but in the 1980s, there were 100,000 council houses in Manchester. About the same in Salford, I think. There aren't any now, because they're all in the hands of housing associations. Housing associations started on the margin of the state sector because they provided for certain needs, people with learning difficulties, people with mental health difficulties, other people, where the traditional council estate didn't necessarily work. So they were on the margin, very much voluntary organisations, in many ways fitting the community-led models that people have talked about this afternoon. And then, over a really quite short period of time, they have become mass private landlords with the rents gone absolutely through the roof and the chief executives paid in 6 figures. Sorry, but my point is this. Rent, in the 1980s, was argued to be something that should cover repairs and maintenance and management. No profits, repairs and maintenance and management. And my question here is, in this affordability debate, can we please get back to the idea that rents cover what they should pay for rather than anything else? Problems with land understood, problems with ownership, all of that, totally understand. We could go on about that for ages as well, but that's a very specific point about what rents should cover. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much. I'm just going to take 2 questions at a time and ask people to respond. If I could just, that was a really interesting and useful contribution, but if people could try and keep it brief just because we're short of time. I'll ask, do you want to begin? Or?
Does it work this time then? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. That's a switch. Well, there was a specific question, wasn't there? I feel emotional, or do you feel emotional actually? But there was a specific question about will this get passed? So I'm not a politician, it's not my job to express odds. All I would say is that the journey to have reached here has been about several panel discussions with lots of members in rooms. It's been about a Labour group meeting. In the context of Manchester, Labour is 94 out of 96 councillors. So a lot of those attended that particular session. I wasn't in the room for that, but I was for the earlier policy panels. It went through a scrutiny which had around 20 members around the table, went through very positively on Wednesday last week. So you can draw your own conclusions about the direction it's headed in. But generally speaking, one wouldn't put something forward that one thought wasn't likely to be supported. So I'm very hopeful that come Wednesday it's supported. The final thing I'd say on that is you can watch it on TV. So tune into our website.
There are some councillors from Manchester at the back as well if you want to log in and support them.
It'll be counterpart. It's a Labour group, so it's group policy, so we'll get past that exactly.
As an officer, I was being more sensitive. I'll only I touched briefly on the second question. So you raised a few different things in there, really. Around just a little update around some of the Grenfell stuff around safety, which obviously everybody has a very human connection to. The council at full council decided a couple of weeks ago that it was going to approve a final budget for sprinklers on 35 high-rise blocks in council ownership around the city. And I should point out, just to correct the gentleman there that I understood the spirit he was referring to, that Manchester City Council still owns around 16,000 homes. So whilst the majority of the homes it used to own have been transferred to registered providers or housing associations, whichever language you prefer, there are still around 16,000 homes still owned by the council. So we've approved 35 tower blocks sprinkler programmes. In addition, there are around 15, 16 tower blocks privately owned within Manchester, as well as numbers as well in Salford. They're more problematic, truthfully, because there are all manner of developers, builders, warranty providers and others keen to point out why they're not liable for the replacement of those cladding situations. I'm very clear, however, as our members, that residents should not pay. I should echo actually government are clear about that too. What are we doing about that? Well, actually, we focused our energy in the short term on a very public situation, which is 2 blocks which Lend-Lease developed around 10 years ago. And you may have spotted on social media, we have made a big song and dance about it, that Lend-Lease came and finally met residents a couple of weeks ago and pledged to pay for their cladding, which was a massive step forward. There's a few mechanical steps to resolve in the new year, but that genuinely is a massive, massive achievement and will help us move forward in addressing the remainder of the tower blocks. More broadly, in the paper I described earlier, the council are committed to looking at the private rented sector in the first few months of next year, which touches on some of the issues you described. It touches on the growth in statutory homelessness, which Paul mentioned earlier. There are a number of challenges to address there, but we need some time to think about them properly and address them properly in just the same way we spent the last few months looking at affordability. So I won't speculate on where we may end up in that respect, but hopefully that starts to touch on some, and I'll hand over to Paul.
Okay, I don't think I'll respond to the lady's question. I think you've answered that, so that's great. In terms of hostile environment, I absolutely agree with you. There's absolutely no doubt about it that there is now a hostile environment in this country, and especially in housing policy. But you've kind of got to look to the past in terms of why that's happened, because I don't think it's any coincidence that we have a hostile environment now, given the housing policies we've been pursuing under Thatcher, continue to pursue under Blair, and seemingly continue to pursue under this government, because we are fundamentally losing stock. You know, every day that goes under right to buy, and as I said in my presentation, you know, approximately 40% of homes purchased under right to buy find their way into the private rented sector. That decimates, in some respects, communities and neighbourhoods, and it removes local authorities from having leverage and influence around tackling housing crisis at a very local level. And this has been going on for years, absolutely years. You know, I said since the 1980s, since right to buy has been in place, over 92,000 homes have been lost within Greater Manchester. since that legislation's been in place. We've lobbied government around pausing that in the short term, but they're not interested in actually pausing right to buy for Greater Manchester, despite us providing them with the evidence base that this is exacerbating problems here in Greater Manchester. I absolutely agree with you that we should campaign on a secure home for all. I think absolutely. I mean, for me, a roof over someone's head is a moral right at the end of the day. It shouldn't be determined by their race, by their sexuality, by their citizen status in the case of asylum seekers and refugees. But, you know, we've got to get government to listen to us on this. So this has to be bigger than Greater Manchester, I would say. Because at the moment, although government acknowledge we have a housing crisis in the United Kingdom, I don't see them doing very much to actually tackle some of those issues. And certainly where I've lobbied, we've not made great progress, certainly around things like right to buy. On the issue of safety and kind of thinking post-Grenfell, one of the things I do is chair the high-rise task force within Greater Manchester. And, you know, it's really, really worrying how long it has taken for us to get just some notion of how we can move forward from this current government. And we're still in a position now where the government hasn't formally responded to the Hackett Review. You know, so in terms of building regulations moving forward and the fire safety order in terms of how that's implemented moving forward, you know, we have absolutely no clarity from this government. The legislative process, you'll be aware, is currently caught up in Brexit, so actually getting primary legislation through in this country at the moment is almost nigh impossible. But we continue to meet with MHCLG and civil servants on this issue because we desperately need solutions. And what we've got here in terms of safety is a kind of two-tier system. So government have come forward, as you probably know, with £400 million for people in social housing and council housing to get the cladding removed and replaced as quick as possible. There's been testing of ACM systems, but that's all there's been testing of. There's lots of other systems, cladding buildings up and down this country, that haven't even been tested by the BRE yet. So we have absolutely no clarity on any of that moving forward. So safety has to be at the heart of what we do here. Because I certainly know, with my GMSF hat on, one of the things the people of Greater Manchester are asking for, in a sense, is more urban density, so we don't have to release Greenbelt, because green infrastructure is seen as very, very important to the people of Greater Manchester. We do have a government that are committed to an arbitrary figure of housing. You probably know 300,000 homes per year by the mid-2020s is what this current government wants to deliver. I've been asking them how on earth they've arrived at that figure. I still don't have an answer to that question. So yeah, absolutely, I do agree. We do need a campaign on secure homes for all, but I think we have to acknowledge the difficulty in really moving some of this forward. And unless government change policies on a whole raft of different areas around housing, I really fear how much progress we'll be able to make with some of this. On the issue of housing rights, I think that was a point really well made, but if you look at what government have done to legal aid over recent years, they've literally decimated it. So we've got a government that doesn't really believe in exercising your rights and access to justice. So we've got an uphill struggle to just be able to, you know, allow people to be able to access their rights in legislation, you know. So it's going to be no easy challenge, but it's absolutely the right thing to do, and I think we should always be motivated by the moral argument in all of this, if I'm honest.
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, just on the second question, because I think there were a couple of really important points made. One about the language of the hostile environment, and some of the comments by senior politicians in Greater Manchester that in my view presenting asylum seekers as a cost. Yes, I think that's quite a dangerous game, and people shouldn't be doing that under any circumstances. On the second issue, around the issue around rents in relation to development, the question, is there a risk that if community development could see a repeat with the housing association sector, maybe start off with small community focused groups that become developers in their own right and have a larger and more commercialised? Yes, I do think that's a risk. If we look at community-led housing in the sense of expanding it for its own sake, it's kind of like just another sector in the housing market. I think to really get the benefits, you need to look at it in the wider role it plays, what can it be a vehicle for, in wider democratic approaches to land development and how we construct our cities. And it does depend on the market, purely. To build more, then I think there are dangers that we do see greater commercialisation, just to repeat the past mistakes. Yeah.
Thanks, Richard. I know John wanted to come in very briefly. Can I just ask, we've obviously, as the gentleman kind of pointed out, community-led housing is operating within a much bigger housing system, and there are much wider issues. But if we could, for the rest of the session, focus questions and contributions around community-led housing, given that that's what we were here for, that would be great. John.
Just 30 seconds, because I remembered the word stigma that was used. So the council house building programme that the council are proposing for Wednesday, the 3,000 homes, clearly some are to replace right to buys, which will happen over the same 10-year period that they will be delivered. But it will lead to net new council homes. So on top of the 16,000 I was explaining before, there will be net new council homes. The second thing is around stigma. So I think I'm here with my colleagues to tell a different story about council housing and to tell it better. So we talked about what that story is, but it's also about the storytelling process. So one of the things in the paper you would see is that we've partnered up with George Clark, who's a famous TV celebrity, and he grew up on a council housing estate like I did, and has a passion for those. And the words he uses is the programme which he's working on with us, which will air towards the end of next year, will be about celebrating council house building and trying to get away from the stigma that's occasionally associated with it. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Okay, I'll take 3 questions this time, I think.
I've got the mic, thanks. Thank you. I'm just wondering, I'm really pleased that there is being a shake-up in the Labour Council, because obviously a lot of Labour voters don't feel that they're getting actually a Labour Council. I'm wondering whether Labour politicians are thinking about the public image of who they're associating with. I'm a private owner in a flat covered in cladding, and I've been upset recently about the relationship between the council and Urban Splash in particular. I've been very upset about the Mayor of Manchester introducing an exhibition for Urban Splash, but it's not just Urban Splash. I'm thinking about Fred Dunn, I'm thinking about trips away with politicians, I'm thinking about how the new Labour that might be coming in, or the new version of old Labour, might be able to communicate that they genuinely are concerned about housing and they genuinely are concerned about citizens rather than developers and prioritising developers and those developers' profits.
I think this lady was in... Okay, Hannah, you probably know better than me, actually.
My question is to John Paul. Forgive the Beatles, Paul. It's about community land trust. I come to the first meeting at the Quaker House, and I think the point of that meeting for me was the fact that local people in Manchester are looking for alternative ways to approach housing, and it's called Housing Futures. And then I feel like today, like the presence of you both is due to the work done by the people in the local area to bring these questions forward. So a lot of people was at the meetings to learn about alternatives to housing, such as community land trust. And now we've got a proposal for community land trust by the council. And I feel like it's almost in jest of the work done by the people in the area. And I know that a couple of, sorry, I forgot your name, sorry. Sophie mentioned that she'd been going to local areas such as Panellists with Richard and Tom. And I feel like they're actually getting really immersed in the grassroots of the problem, and they're bringing these events to us. So and clearly you've reflected on that by bringing these proposals forward. So, but is there really a true incentive to go out there and communicate with the people around Manchester about community land trust? Because we're the people putting on these events, and you just can't come and answering questions. Do you know what I mean? So is there a real incentive to actually put these things forward? Do you know what I mean?
On the subject of community and grassroots housing, I literally know groups who have got projects, who are ready to build, who want to house people, and they get cold-shouldered. The tension between you, the people who do things, and your political bosses, they fall into that. You do get the feeling that if you want to do some shipping container houses for homeless people, you will be cold-shouldered. But if Ian Simpson rocks up and wants to bulldoze the town hall and replace it with 46 floors of Lego, that's fine. So how that tension between you that wants to do things and the political bosses and their beliefs and everything, how can community groups that are ready to build get through that if they're just doors closed in the face?
We respond to this and we'll try and fit one more round in.
So I might go first then. So I won't personalise my response about particular development. Sorry, is that working? Yeah. I won't personalise my response about particular developers. So you mentioned Urban Splash in your question, for example. I mean, what I would say is that part of my role is, for example, at one end, grassroots housing, which is what this event's about. Part of my role is about creating market sale homes, market rent homes that people also need in Manchester because it's a successful city, it's a growing city economically, and it needs a full range of housing. And as part of that, we work with a whole raft of developers, some of whom we work with on our lands, some of whom are operating in the marketplace more widely, and I spend a lot of time working with those as well. I understand the sentiment of the question, and I understand how people sometimes feel about developers. For me, my approach is not to, if you like, have a go at developers. It's about trying to turn it on its head, and as I mentioned earlier, try and get the right ethics and social value out of developers. And increasingly, when we are picking our developer partners, we're looking for that social value. So social value, whatever that means, that's an event all on its own, whether that's jobs or what have you. We give 20% of the scoring in all of our decisions now to social value, as well as design quality, how many homes will be created, affordability, etc. So I would just say to you, things are changing in the way that we're working. Some of that change is already underway and more of it will come. And I think you'll see if we have this event in a year, that the flavour will be even different to the one today. I suppose all I can say about the sort of the two community questions, which are similar in nature, really, is firstly I'm sincere. So there's all sorts of things I could do on a Saturday that, bearing in mind I live the other side of Sheffield, which aren't coming to this room and spending time talking about community-led housing. I'm genuinely only here on my Saturday because I want to be here and I want to be having this debate and I want to be signalling that things are changing. As I used the language earlier, sort of changing the direction of a ship. So bringing about the change which my political bosses want to see is not straightforward. It's always in life reasonably easy to think the thought and much harder to deliver the thought. So I'm having to really, to have brought Lend-Lease into a room to say that they were going to spend £5 million replacing the cladding on a tower block, I can promise you was not the easiest thing to do, and took a number of months of concerted effort from me and government and others to make that happen. So you have to apply yourself to challenges one at a time, not do 100 things badly. I'm all about doing, five things at a time really, really well and then moving on to the next five.
Can I just say on that, because I wasn't coming to talk about cladding, but you brought it up today.
Yeah.
With the tower blocks that you started with in the Green Quarter, they were the people in the media and they were the most noticeable.
Yeah.
But we actually have been taken to court before them.
Yeah.
And Urban Splash were not mentioned and they weren't dealt with, and it hasn't been until very recently that any kind of conversation about moving it forward has been taken forward.
Yeah.
And it seems to be that they were very much ignored because they've got this long-term relationship with certain politicians within the Labour Council. There's been lots of land deals that have been done both in Salford and in Manchester, and it's just a slap in the face for residents to then have the Mayor introducing a celebration of Urban Splash using terms like we do things differently and it will never work. Well, a building covered in cladding doesn't work.
I can only say myself, I'm new. So I'm, you know, judge me personally by today and onwards, as it were.
You're talking about things and you're not getting it very accurate, and it's people are under threat of spiralling bills. So if this is your role, because it's not my role, and I could be doing other things on a Saturday as well, it'd be useful to get that timeline straight.
Yeah, okay. Well, I can have an offline conversation with you about the specifics of your block, which I assume is chips, is it?
No, they've put cladding, combustible cladding that they're not paying for all over the country.
Yeah.
So chips, they've done it in Leeds and they've done it in Manchester. I've come to talk about the community-led housing, but it's just that you brought it up and you're getting a lot of things inaccurate.
Yeah.
You know, so I was hoping to sell, can't sell, because
Yeah.
I wanted to put into this kind of project.
Yeah.
But there needs to be something done about that relationship, and there needs to be a public outing of that kind of relationship that the councillors have with the developers, so that there's some real change, because in closed meetings or quiet meetings like this, we're being given a message that there's change, but then councillors need to think about the behaviours out there in terms of the MEN, in terms of what they're doing publicly, in terms of the public status with these developers, for us to look like we're moving in the right direction.
Sorry to interrupt, but I don't mean to, it's obviously very important, but
Have you finished now, yeah?
Yeah, carry on.
Yeah. Okay, I'll take the first question, which is about Labour politicians and working with developers in the city region. The housing market has to meet everyone's needs. We're here today to talk about community-led housing. My priority at the moment is building truly affordable housing in the city of Salford, and we've set up a development company to try and do that. But we can't talk about the market and what's happening here within Greater Manchester without acknowledging some of the constraints placed on local authorities up and down this country. You know, my revenue budget has been absolutely hammered. We've lost 50% of our funding. The people who build housing now, by and large, is the private sector. It's not councils. Why? There's been caps on housing revenue accounts for many, many years. And only recently has government actually lifted those housing revenue account caps. And we're currently working through the detail about what that actually means for local authorities here in Greater Manchester, because government have presented it as some sort of panacea, but actually what you could find yourself doing is building brand new homes, those homes being subjected to right to buy at huge discounts, since the discounts were hiked back in 2012. You then lose your stock after building those new properties in a few years' time. That potentially finds its way into the private rented sector, and your housing revenue account is having to service that debt that's there. So, you know, working through some of this is going to be really, really tough. We've got a planning policy framework, as I said in my speech, which does not support the building of truly affordable housing. It protects developer profits over building truly affordable housing and contributions to infrastructure. To change these sorts of things requires, in my opinion, a change of government. So we have to be clear about some of the constraints that are placed on us. We are trying to do what we can within these constraints. But I have to say, we are going to have to continue to work with the development community to do all the stuff that John talked about in terms of social value. You know, the construction industry in Greater Manchester creates loads of jobs for the people of Greater Manchester, keeps food on the table, allows them to actually own their own home potentially, and, you know, look after themselves. So we mustn't underestimate what the construction sector is doing. It's interesting that developers are often targeted, but actually, for me, the real problem quite often sits with the landowners, who literally walk away with millions and millions of pounds in a real short space of time in the grand scheme of things, and quite often have absolutely no commitment to Greater Manchester, the people of Greater Manchester, and what we're trying to do here. So actually we need to get this balance right between landowners, developers and local authorities, absolutely. But when we talk about the housing market, it is multifaceted. We are going to continue to need to develop housing through the market. Why? Because local authorities won't be able to actually deliver the numbers of houses we want to deliver. And also, where's choice in all of this? Not everyone wants to live in a council house or a social house. And we're losing social housing and council housing because of the government's right to buy. So, you know, when we talk about this, let's deal with the complexity, because this is a really complex issue that goes to the heart of national government policy, be that on housing or be that on planning, or be that even with regards to the building regulations and the fire safety order, as we've recently seen post-Grenfell. On community land trusts and the question you raised about, you know, us being here today and whether or not we're actually sincere in what we're doing.
It wasn't that, it was about how you can actually interact with the local communities as GMHA happen.
Okay, so
they're the ones pioneering it, not not yourselves. You're just reflecting and responding on good work done by independent bodies.
So I can assure, I don't know who you are, but I can assure you I've met with GM Housing Action on a number of occasions actually. Yeah, absolutely. The Housing Action and obviously the communities and the organisations that are part of that Housing Action network. I've met with them on several occasions. Why? Because I see them as critical in terms of informing the Greater Manchester housing strategy moving forward. So all I can say is I'm very much sincere. And actually, it was housing action and housing justice that politicised me. So before I became a politician and ultimately the Mayor of Salford, I was doing stuff within my community, in my residents' association, putting pressure on the council back in the day around housing standards. I also was a supporter of the fourth option in council housing, if you remember that back in the day, where basically under New Labour, they were looking at selling off or pushing things into arm's length management organisations as a precursor to them then finding their way into housing associations. So I'm happy to have a conversation with you. All I would say is I'm very much committed to working with everyone.
It's not about you two individually, it's about your heading organisations, aren't you? So how are your organisations, not the sincerity of you two.
Okay.
Where's the sincerity of your organisation? And how's your organisation going to sincerely do it? Not you two as people, you both speak brilliantly. But where's your organisation going to stick to its sincerity, like GMHA does?
And I think there's also a lack of understanding that people might have the qualifications.
I'm sorry, some of the people have had their hands up. I can't. We're really running out of time. I wish we had more time, but we don't. I know that we're going to have to close this conversation. I'm sorry, I have asked you. Sorry.
I know we've listened to you for a long time about something else.
I'm going to have to draw the session to a close because otherwise we're not going to have time for the breakout sessions. On the gentleman's point here, I think what he was trying to get at referred to some of the things I was reflecting on at the beginning of the session to do with low-income communities and information and relationships between decision makers and people in those communities, and a need for the combined authority and the local authorities to actually go out to those places and listen to people instead of making decisions before they've listened. So I just wanted to clarify that that's what this gentleman was getting at. I think John's going to address that shortly, and then we really need to finish. You can grab a coffee or a cup of tea or some juice in the back room, and then I will ask people to go straight to their breakout sessions, but I'm just going to let John have a final comment.
It was only just to say that so in the new year, I haven't got an exact timetable on it yet, we'll be calling for interest from resident groups, community groups who are interested in those 3 pilot schemes to come and talk with us and for us to come and talk with them. What I would say in that is sometimes there are some big voices, so there are some noisy groups. Some groups are quieter. What we have to ensure is that we listen to all groups and we remove the loudness effect, and we make sure we find those that are sincere coming back at us and have the tenacity, the energy, etc. that you really need to make these schemes work. And if as part of that we need to come out and see you, we absolutely will come out and see you. Okay?
Thank you, John. Thanks. Thank you to everyone. I'm really sorry to people who didn't get to ask a question, but thank you to all our panellists. It's been a really interesting conversation. Please don't rush off. Stay for the sessions. We'll come back here at 10 to 4 for some final reflections.